All right, my friends. My name is Bishop Olsenbach, and this is my YouTube channel and my Facebook group, and I want to welcome you to tonight's program. I got Mr. Gilbert and Gary Wayne, and we're going to be exposing Nephilim culture. My friends, I get asked, what is Nephilim culture? My friends, look around you. What ain't Nephilim culture? Just look around you. But these two guys right here got over a decade. I'm not calling y'all old or anything. I got over pretty long, between both of y'all should be able to field some questions. But before we do, I guess um, I want to start with you, Mr. Gilbert. What is the Nicene Council? What was the Nicene Council, and can you elaborate on anything about the Nicene Council?
The Nicene Council.
Yes. Did I saying that right, Gary?
Or are you talking about an Enochian?
No.
No?
Or Nicene, as in where they assembled the
Nicene.
gospel?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Well, that was, and this is not an area that I've studied in any depth, but as I understand it, it was a meeting called by the Emperor Constantine to around the year 323 AD to try to hammer out some points of doctrine to make sure that what was being taught among Christians had some consistent theology. There were a number of differences in what was being taught at the time. I know that there are those who believe that this is where Constantine dictated what would be in the Bible, or eliminated some other points of view that he wasn't personally happy with. And scholars that I've interviewed about that, like the late Dr. Michael Heiser, just really say that is not really an accurate representation of what happened at the Nicene Council. But again, I have to confess, it's not something I've done a deep study on. I will say that the canon of Scripture, the books that were supposed to be in the Bible or that are in the Bible today, had pretty much been decided about a century before the Council of Nicaea.
Amen.
Yeah,
Gary,
and I would agree with what Derek is saying. I know, in a lot of things, you got a lot of, I hate to say it, but misinformation that gets spread out there. And I'm not saying the Nicene Council methodology and ultimate result may be perfect, but I do agree that for the most part, they were putting in the books that were already being used for the most part, but there was more going on at the time. So you had two primary beliefs in the rising Christianity. One was the Gnostic, and I'll use that from a more modern contemporary term, but the polytheist version, where they adopted Jesus into their belief system, but not as deity status, as a mortal prophet and a teacher. And so you had a lot of gospels that were being presented out there and were presenting and laced with polytheist doctrines and ideology and misrepresentation of some of what was agreed upon facts. And a lot of those gospels show up in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So there's a lot of ones that maybe look legitimate, and you really have to have a critical eye on those ones to say, well, why weren't they put in? Did they not have them? Or is there just some of these polytheist things that are in there? And many of them have that. I mean, it's laden with it. So you had two schools of thought that were fighting for primacy. And so with the Constantine win, they wanted to get a consistency to the canon that they were going to utilize and use it sort of in the same way that was done with Zoroastrianism in Persia a few hundred years before to unite the empire. But of course, that uniting the empire also led in a number of Mithraic ideologies into the rituals, and that's linked into Zoroastrian and some Egyptian mythology. But the canon seemed to be a lot more consistent with what the bishops were trying to do. So they're trying to weigh out the authenticity of the books that were going in there, and could they take it back to a known writer, and was there a testimony that went to it, and was it consistent with what the majority of the writers were talking about, because they didn't want to have corrupted ones put in that may show a conflict. And so they were trying to do it in that sort of manner, but that doesn't mean some of the gospels may not have got in that maybe should have got in. And I don't know which ones those would be, but a lot of people are making an argument that a number should have got in there. And so when you look at something like the Book of Enoch, you have, one of the great sort of treasures is what we look at it today, although it's not, we don't have an original Hebrew manuscript for it at the time. And I don't believe they did at the time either. And so the surviving manuscripts as they come down through history are Aramaic, Ge'ez, and Greek, and only fragments of the original Hebrew text. And so although you get a lot of things that seem to be based on Hebrew texts, like let's say the Ophanim or something, and sons of gods and things like that, that seems to be very consistent biblically, but there are corruptions that are in there too. So you have to read it with a grain of salt as well. And then there's a lot of debate as to, and probably went on at that time, as to how large should that book be, and is the whole book that we have today what that book should have been, or was there other parts that were added? And so anyways, you get into all of these sort of debates in terms of establishing the legitimacy. And so what we have is what they presented. And what's interesting as well is that the King James Version writers added some of the books that I'm not sure whether they're accepted by the Nicene Council. I haven't done research that far enough, but they had the KJV Apocrypha. So like First and Second Ezra, the Book of Wisdom, the Maccabees, those kinds of books that don't show up in the Bible today. And they were put into the Apocrypha because they thought it was reasonably sound, but that was the verification issue that they were struggling with, and maybe some consistency things here or there. But they thought they were strong enough to put in the KJV originally, but they're not there today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then the bottom line is that the debate over which books should be in the Bible was not really one of the major topics that was at the Council of Nicaea. I had to check some notes here because, again, I've talked with scholars about this in the past, but it's not something that is a primary area of study. The main dispute that was argued over at the Council of Nicaea was the heresy called Arianism. Arius, who was an early bishop, argued that Jesus had a beginning, that he was a created being rather than the creator. And of course, if you're a Trinitarian Christian, you believe that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are, the three in one, that Jesus was 100% divine, 100% human, fully divine, fully human. And so the Arian doctrine was a heresy. And that was one of the things that was the primary reason for the Council of Nicaea. That's a doctrine that influenced the church for centuries, even though it was declared a heresy after the Council of Nicaea.
All right. Thank you so much. I know you can break this down for us, Mr. Gilbert, in your own way. Enochian mysticism, Enochian magic. What do you feel about Enochian mysticism, Enochian magic? What is the root of it? Where did it all start?
Well, yeah, but first of all, you can just call me Derek. I feel a little odd. You're calling me Mr. and you're not calling Gary Mr. Wayne, because I have a great deal of respect for Gary, and that doesn't seem quite evenly matched there. But I still feel strange. I think Mr. Gilbert is my father, even though he's been gone for some years.
I'm saying yes, sir, and Mr. I apologize.
No, I appreciate the respect, but no, we can be at a first name basis.
All right, Derek.
I've done some reading on the Book of Enoch, but Enochian mysticism and Enochian magic is a whole nother can of worms. Gary might be better equipped to speak on that. I've been doing a lot of reading lately about the Book of Enoch, especially the second section that's called the Book of Parables, which is chapters 37 to 71 of the book of First Enoch. When we talk about the Book of Enoch, we're usually speaking of the book of First Enoch. There's a second Enoch and a third Enoch that were written in the Christian era. The Book of the Watchers, which is the first 36 chapters of First Enoch, which goes into more detail about the sin of the the sons of God who are just mentioned almost in passing in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. But beginning in chapter 37, it gets into a prophetic section. And what I find really fascinating is that that section of the book of Enoch was only written in the 1st century BC. It was the last section of what we call the book of First Enoch that was completed. And it uses some terminology and teaches some ideas that are not found in any prior Jewish writing. In other words, it was not in the Old Testament and not found in any of the writings in Qumran. This chapters 37 through 71, the book of parables section of the book of First Enoch, where there was a reference in First Enoch chapter 50 to the idea that God could actually forgive sinners if they repented. This is not something that the Essenes at Qumran, the ones who compiled and preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls, would have accepted. They believed you had to follow all of their rules. Now, they did believe that God would have to personally intervene to fix the world because the sin of those watchers, mentioned in the first 36 chapters of First Enoch, had so broken the world that only direct intervention by God could fix things. But you can only be forgiven if you joined their community, separated from the world, and followed all of their rules. Well, beginning in chapter 37, that changes a little bit, and there is a mention in chapter 50 that you could be forgiven, that a group called the Others would see God forgiving the righteous when he came and returned and punished the sinful angels and wicked kings and so on. And this was a totally new thing, which is why I think, and scholars believe, that section, that second part of the book of First Enoch, the book of parables, has never been found at Qumran. In other words, it was written by a group of Essenes, but not the ones who lived at Qumran. There was another group that lived in the north next to the Sea of Galilee, very close to where Mary Magdalene was from, the town of Magdala. So that, and the fact that there's a mention of this agent of God's divine judgment who would be called the Son of Man, which is mentioned in passing in Daniel chapter 7, when Daniel has a vision of the Ancient of Days and one at his right hand like a son of man, which is a way in the Old Testament language of essentially saying one who looks like a human. But in the book of First Enoch, beginning of chapter 37, 18 times they mention the Son of Man who comes and brings judgment to the earth. And of course, 78 times in the New Testament, Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man. And this is coming from a text that was completed, according to scholars, about the time that Jesus was born. So you've got the book of Enoch that I think had a real powerful influence on New Testament theology, which is kind of a new concept. Well, it's new to me. There are probably scholars out there who are just, so what took you so long? But, this is a new idea to me. It certainly wasn't taught in any of the churches that I've attended or been members of growing up, or to this day, in fact. But when it gets down to how the occult has twisted this idea and the idea of Enochian mysticism and Gnosticism and how they've twisted it into magic, honestly, I can't really speak to that with any expertise.
All right. That's not a problem, Derek. Gary, you want to break it down for us about Cain?
Sure. So, and just before I move into that, I just wanted to underline a couple of things that Derek was talking about, that, those chapters where it uses the Son of Man. And I found that absolutely sort of startling. And so you also have further on into the book of Enoch, you get into some prophecy, which is rather startling, but again, very consistent what is showing up in Daniel and the New Testament prophecy. And
right.
So you get down to the point with some of these additions as to when they might be added, because they certainly wouldn't go back to the Torah, being sort of written in 100 BC, and some people might even say as far as 200 AD, but I think there's no real evidence to suggest that. They're just trying to account for where does this addition come from, and how could it be prophecy that was sort of ignored by so many of the Judeans. But so you have all of that. So, and it's what makes the book of Enoch so interesting to read, that it doesn't always perfectly line up with the Bible, but there is so much that does. And then the further context that it has is context that the Bible talks about. So it's a matter of how far does that go. And so that's one of the things I really love about Book of Enoch. I just don't quite elevate it to scripture level, but because of some of the corruptions that are in there. But it's a worthy read for Christians, I think, and I think you can safely read it, and then you can decide for yourself whether or not it fits. And within the Book of Enoch, you get this knowledge that is being presented to humans from the fallen angels. And so this is the source of the knowledge. It's from the angelic knowledge and the illicit angelic knowledge and the technology that is being passed on by these fallen angels and into two groups of people. I think initially, as you would read the Book of Enoch, it happens before the creation of the giants. I think there's a good case for that. I think the Gnostics also believe, and certainly the Masonic societies believe, that Enoch, son of Cain, had already separated the knowledge that Adam had learned from God, running a super-sized, you can't even call it a ranch. I mean, it goes from the Nile to the Euphrates to the Caspian Sea it's a monster piece of territory. And he's looking after orchards, and he's looking after forests, and he's looking after tamed animals, and growing the grasses and the the crops that we would known as the wheat crops. And so he would have had to have received some significant knowledge to be able to do this after Jehovah created him. And so this is the knowledge that they say was passed down to Cain and to Abel, and then also Seth later. And of course, Cain perverts that knowledge and then teaches it to his first son, Enoch, who develops that knowledge. And then, according to the Gnostics, again, it gets put into 7 sacred sciences, as we understand it, as the 7 liberal arts today. And they continue to develop that when at some point in time between then and the creation of the giants, it merges with the angelic knowledge and takes it to a whole new level. And so when it's talking about the sorceries in the Book of Enoch, and the herbs and the alchemy and the things that sort of go in it, and the knowledge to make weapons and the arts of war, that's the illicit knowledge that is being taught, that is going to sort of work with the creation of the giants and create a new hierarchy with this Enochian mysticism that you would know as the polytheist pantheon before the flood, that's honoring these watchers who created the giants and the angels that have followed them, and that they are going to parade the world into apocalypse with this knowledge, and they're going to corrupt everything. And in Genesis 6 and 7, we get the notion that the whole world was corrupted. All of the earth was corrupted, as is probably the more accurate term. And that word corrupt is the Hebrew word shakath, and it means to ruin, decay, words like that. And the implication is if the whole earth has been decayed or ruined or perverted, and all the other words that would go along that are associated with it, is they would have been using that knowledge and that magic to do so, and they would be changing the plant genome, they would be changing the DNA of animals, they would be creating other types of beings, probably other than Nephilim. They would be creating chimera type of beings, just as we're starting to reach that level of knowledge again. And I think we're probably even being helped by some of that angelic knowledge to be able to get there, so that nothing is new under the sun, and what was will be again. Just my sort of interpretation in terms of what we're starting to see and connecting it back to the days of Noah. And all of this knowledge, they could do all sorts of things. And one of the things that they would do is they created abortion, which is another thing that we're seeing today. And that this was very, very popular and very, very powerful. And it was used in part to control the world, but also to corrupt the world. And it's like they're trying to corrupt it so it wasn't going to be usable for humankind, that they would be remembered no more, that they would be destroyed from the face of the earth by their leadership, the fallen angels, and executed by their spurious offspring, or that God would have to step in and wipe them from the world. Either way, they would have been pleased, because then the Adamites would not reach their destiny. And so all of that knowledge is that Enochian magic. And magic is rooted we get that in the New Testament and in the Old Testament, and it's rooted in this knowledge. It's rooted in priestly development of that knowledge and into the mystery schools that we see all down through history. And magi is rooted in magic, as it's coming from Greek, and then it goes back to an original Hebrew word. So when we see sorceries that are in the book of Revelation, this is part of that alchemy, then, of the knowledge. And that's the pharmakeia, pharmakous, pharmakos words that are being used, that Babylon is going to deceive the world with, or lead the world astray with. And so you can imagine that this Enochian magic, as part of the days of Noah, is going to be part of what happens in the end time again. So it's important to understand where all of these words like sorcerers and wizards and magic and enchanters, all of this is polytheist terms that have sort of been like viral or polluting the world ever since. And we get a lot of those words that show up in the Old Testament to show veracity as to that they're to be taken serious, and that we need to learn about where it came from and not be seduced or deceived by them.
That's right, Gary. And it was Tammy Ball who did the abortion, fallen angel's name. That was the fallen angel, because they all different angels taught mankind something different.
Yeah. So
like you
in
said,
the
in
the Tuatha De Danann, and the Scythians as they moved up the Danube River, in that understanding, and certainly specifically to Vlad the Impaler's bloodline and their belief system is they take that name back to Tamiel. And Kazadia, it was one of the other names of Tamiel, as they would call them. And they would take that in a form of a T, and they called it Camiel. And it's like, it's the same sort of double entendre for a T today, but it doesn't cause abortions. But that's how they believe that it was taken. And that comes out of, that's for the research I got on that, it comes right out of that Scythian belief system. And of course, they took their tribe back to the Agrathi, and that was one of the tribes of Hercules, son of Zeus.
Ethiopian canon. It couldn't really be touched with. 2 and 3, they got tampered with. Got to be really careful what you study in 2 and 3. But book 1 was saying there's 2 discrepancies, and what is that, Gary? The discrepancies in book 1 of Enoch.
You're asking about what some of the corruptions are in the first book of Enoch? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, sir.
So,
yes, sir.
Okay, yeah, one of the examples is that it, in at least in the Giaz version, that's the one I have, and has a few more verses than the Aryan or the Aramaic version. It has the fallen angels building the ark, and that's a typical Gnostic belief. You saw that in the last Noah movie. And so you get some of those little corruptions in there that just aren't accurate and consistent within the Bible. So I think in some of the translations, as it comes down, some of those translators, and in this case, Alexander Bruce, a descendant of Robert the Bruce, a Gnostic and a Freemason, probably had a little bit of biases in some of his translations from what he was doing. And so that would be one of them. There are other ones, but just so that everybody knows, I think it's like 99% accurate, but there's a couple of those little tweaks. Another one would be, it has Enoch being 500 years old in the book of Enoch. Well, as I recall, Enoch, son of Seth, or son of Jared, was taken to heaven when he was 325 years old. So the Enoch that would be on earth at 500 years old is likely a reference and a marker for their belief system for being Enoch, son of Cain, whom is a great patriarch of the Masonic societies.
That's interesting because there's some evidence to suggest that the son of Enoch, the son of Cain, whose name was Irad in the Bible, may be the one for whom Cain built that first city mentioned in the book of Genesis, because the Sumerian king lists mention that their first city was named Eridu, which was the site of the oldest ziggurat in Mesopotamia, which would have been the largest if it had ever been completed. That was the temple of Enki, the lord of the Abzu, or the abyss. But I think there were like 18 levels to that temple, and the top level, which would have been the largest ziggurat in all of Mesopotamia, was never finished. According to scholars, it was abandoned around the end of the Uruk period of history, or right around 3100 BC, according to the dating used by archaeologists. But I think it's interesting that this temple, which played a key role in Mesopotamian religious history, I mean, even down to the time of Nebuchadnezzar, the kings of Babylon were sometimes referring to themselves as the king of Eridu at Babylon. That may have been built by Cain for his grandson Irad. I go into that in one of my books.
Yeah, well, it would make perfect sense, Derek, because the first city is Hanok or Enoch, and that's thought to be Uruk. And how some of the researchers get there is that Uruk in Sumerian was Unugi, Unugi, and the K and the G were pronounced as we would pronounce the K, right? So Anuki. So, and it would be Anuk, and if you look at the spelling of Enoch in Hebrew, it's Hanok, right? And the H would be sort of silent in that. And then with that technology that Cain had, that was passed on to Enoch, several cities would have been built with Enoch being generally, and his descendants being sort of formed into the Sumerian kings list as part of the kings list in Mesopotamia. So it makes perfect sense that knowledge is one of the things that were making the hunters and gatherers into an agrarian society that was begat by Cain.
Cain, who taught Cain, mysticism? Somebody had to teach Cain. And my, I think, after reading Gary's book and others, Cain. It had, the fallen ones came and taught the 200 that fell to Mount Hermon. They taught the humans. They perverted the knowledge. I'm sure they went to the land of Nod and taught Cain, or Lilith that had, maybe taught Cain. What's your view about that?
Oh, I think that all of the descendants of Cain, and particularly Cain and Enoch, were being fed knowledge because they converted over to polytheism, and they created the seven sciences, and then they created mysticism to house that sciences and put it into initiatory degrees to protect it from the people they would have called mundane, and at that time it would have been the Sethites, right? So they wanted to protect that knowledge from the other bloodline. So all that knowledge is coming down through the fallen angels that are adding on to that. And so when you hear of some of the great Mason adepts, great in their understanding of what great is and calling themselves great, I guess, it's the knowledge of Enoch learned from the angels that was used to build the pyramids before the flood. And even though they're dated in secular history to like 2400 BC, in that range with Khepru and Khufu, on the stela of Menes, Narma, is you see that 52-degree slope Great Pyramid, and that's dated to about 3000 BC. There's more evidence than that is out there, but there was some great technology that was passed on. So Enoch learned it from the Watchers, and so when you get into the other books of Enoch 2 and 3, and those later written editions, as Derek was talking about, it is telling you from their belief system that Enoch learned his knowledge from the angels, and he was like Thoth. He became a god because of the knowledge. And in third Enoch, he's raised to son of man type of status and to angelic status, and changes his name to Metatron. So, and of course, you hear that versions of Meta out there, which is, I don't think, coincidental with all of that knowledge. And so, yeah, it just, from their belief system, that's for sure who the knowledge came from. And I don't think all of polytheism is wrong. They just see things through a polytheist lens. And I find it acceptable that the fallen angels would have provided knowledge to Enoch and his descendants, and it sort of makes sense of what was going on in that other bloodline.
Yeah, and making sure that we differentiate between the Enoch who was from the line of Seth, who survived the flood, and the Enoch, the son of Cain, who appears to have been the one for whom these books were named. But you're right, Gary. Even in the book of First Enoch, there are some clues in there that perhaps things were corrupted after the Essenes completed the book, right at the end of the 1st century BC. For example, in chapter 71 of First Enoch, it's revealed after, you go from chapter 36 through chapter 70, that this prophetic section describing the arrival of God.
I think we lost Derek. Or did we lose Bishop?
Lost Bishop.
Or do we lose everybody? Okay.
Oh, looks like, yeah, okay.
I can't see your picture. There you are.
Okay. Well, let me start that again. In First Enoch, as you mentioned, there are some inconsistencies there, which is why it's not in the Bible, even though some of the early church fathers like Tertullian thought it should be. But